right, we have one last speaker, and the standing rules for introducing JT is that everything you say has to be true. So let me give you a bit of background. JT was found early in life by John and Martha Kent in a farmer's field. He was raised on a strict diet of raw beef and power cables, routinely brushing his teeth with steel wool. Prior to college, he spent 3 years on the Pro Tour Candyland circuit, culminating with winning the title from Kim Jong-il. He then used those winnings, along with a scholarship for nude tiger wrestling, to attend MSU. And as you saw literally 20 minutes ago, this is where I met him. We met via blogging and realized we live 2 blocks from each other. After years of shenanigans and like 98% of a degree in opera as a prerequisite for any good activist, JT went on to create Skepticon and later worked for the Secular Student Alliance as a high school coordinator. They started off with the tens of high school affiliates when JT started and hundreds when he left. Woe was to the administrator that attempted to obstruct a student with JT on their side. He's now a full-time blogger at What Would JT Do? He's humanity's last great hope against a zombie apocalypse and a burning thorn to bad arguments everywhere.
Hello. Obviously, I'm not David Silverman. If I squint. David had a death in the family, which is why he's not here. And obviously we can't pray for him, and I'm not even going to ask for a moment of silence. But if he were my son, I'd be very proud of him, and I'm sure his mother felt the same way. Dave is one of the busiest people in this movement. He's just moving all the time. The guy just never stops. But whenever you're speaking to him, you are the only thing in his universe. He's just that kind of guy. He's very special. And I will not be as good as Dave, but I will endeavor to be good enough. So, what are we going to talk about? Let's just dive right in. This is Sally Quinn. She writes for the Washington Post. And I'm not getting all the cool animations on mine. Okay. She writes, "This is a religious country. Part of claiming your citizenship is claiming a belief in God, even if you are not Christian. We've got the Creator in our Declaration of Independence. We've got In God We Trust on our coins. We've got one nation under God on our Pledge of Allegiance. And we say prayers in the Senate and House of Representatives to God. This would ring as satire if more people, or if less people, believed it. Sadly, they do. In response to Miss Quinn, I have the following rebuttal. We are Americans. We are the soldiers that fight in your wars. We are the teachers who prepare the next generation. We're the aid workers who make life more comfortable and more happy, not only to people in the United States, but to people suffering all across the world. We are your congressmen. We are the people running for Congress. We are 15% of the population. Channeling David on that one. We are the fastest growing religious demographic in the United States, in all 50 US states. Now, if you think these things are less important than subscription to an ancient myth, you have mismanaged your priorities in a way that makes an absolute mockery of patriotism. We must be honest here. Actual belief in the story of Christianity, in a man rising from the dead and walking on water, says far more to how gullible you are than it says anything about your status as an American citizen. Take that, Sally. So Sally talked about all the ways Christianity is ingrained and intertwined into our culture, and I want to talk about that. We've all heard this argument. Separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. And they're right. The phrase, separation of church and state, is not in our Constitution. That is because the phrase, separation of church and state, is a shorthand description for what the Constitution calls for. I mean, you might as well argue that the word monogamy isn't in the Bible, and therefore the framework and concept of monogamy isn't there. But it is. This is Article 3, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Say that word 5 times fast. The judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under the Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made or which shall be made under their authority. Now, if you take the baby step to admit that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, you're forced to accept that the Supreme Court has the right to rule on its interpretation. And the interpretation of the court has consistently been that the Establishment Clause means there is separation of church and state. There is realistically no denying that the Supreme Court has the authority to make that call. Now, of course, the theocrats will say that the Supreme Court has made the wrong call, but no reasonable person is going to accept the judgment of truck stop lawyers over decades of decisions by people whose lives are spent entrenched in the study of constitutional law and whose decisions are based on decades of established precedents. If the separation clause is illegal, then the federal judiciary must have been mistaken all these years and still is. Now, is that the case? Well, obviously not, but the excuse you'll hear is it's because of activist judges, judicial bias. And those are easily the reactionary buzzwords of the day. But there's no question that the overwhelming majority of church-state separation cases in what has undoubtedly been a nation of Judeo-Christian majority has nevertheless come down on the side of separation. I mean, let's face it, up until recently, 90% of the country was from some Judeo-Christian background. And that is the background of virtually every single Supreme Court justice ever. And yet, clearly and consistently, separation has been the winner. They haven't done this because of their religious beliefs. They have done this in spite of their religious beliefs. Now, the other argument you'll hear is that even though they left God out of the Constitution, they really meant for the separation of church and state to be an idea that would ring as completely false nowadays. But it could have been in the Constitution. I mean, you guys follow politics. Can you imagine a Republican nowadays who would omit God from the Constitution if they were write it today? Of course, I see heads shaking. Of course you couldn't. No one would make that faux pas. It would be right there on the front page with words capitalized that should never have been capitalized. That's what it would look like today. And it could have looked that way back when the Constitution was written. And in fact, the very first piece of legislation that was passed in this country in 1779 was called an Act to Regulate the Time and Manner of Administrating Certain Oaths. It had to do with the oath you swore in when you took office. Had absolutely no reference to God in it. But the proposed piece of legislation had 2 mentions of God in it, and they were stricken before the legislation was passed. Now, if our founding fathers had intended us to intertwine our government with God, there was their chance to do it, and they didn't. But it's even more clear-cut than that, and I'll get to that in a second. The last gasp of the modern-day conservative who will say that separation of church and state is nowhere in the Constitution is a concept called constitutional literalism. And in keeping with my idea that Amanda Knief should give all talks in future conferences, I should bring her up to give this one because she is a lawyer. She would know this much better than I. But basically, it's the idea that the Constitution should be taken literally. It's the last gasp rationalization. It is literally the final excuse for anyone who wants to have their antiquated and unconstitutional religious beliefs forced onto other people in public institutions and culture at large. It has virtually no relevance at all to actual jurisprudence, and even the tiniest thought towards how the country would actually run if we interpreted the Constitution literally reveals it to be not just staggeringly impractical for any society, but just transparently silly. As most of you know, the concept of slavery is actually in the Constitution in word, and nobody wants to interpret that literally. Now, as far as the phrase in the First Amendment goes, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the Supreme Court, the ones with the authority to make that call, have realized that the only way to protect religious freedom is to keep the government out of it. Now, what do I mean by that? What if, for some reason in the future, Muslims became the majority in Congress. The separation of church and state is what keeps that Congress from saying everybody must worship Muhammad, or that nobody can attend a Baptist church. And you can bet your life that if Christians were in that situation, they would be the very first advocates for separation of church and state. But being the majority, they're in a position of privilege that prevents many of them from empathizing with life for those of us in the minority. And that's something we should be hitting them on. Now, as for the Constitution itself and its history, I'm going to give just a really brief glance at that. All right. Was religious language in government documents at the time the Constitution was written? Because if it is, then they had a green light to put religious language into our Constitution. It would mean that they didn't do so intentionally. Well, first we have the meek reference to the Creator in the Declaration of Independence, but that's not even the biggest one. We also have the Articles of Confederation, which praised the great governor of the world, this of course being God. 11 of the 13 states at the time had religious tests in their constitution for office. Delaware is one example. The state of Delaware at the time required faith in God the Father, in Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost of one God, blessed forevermore. The state of Massachusetts said it is the duty of all men in society to worship the Supreme Being. This is 11 out of the 13 states, and these are not even the least inclusive amongst them. Most states required you for an office, whether you were appointed or elected, to be of the Protestant faith. This could have gone into the Constitution, but it didn't. Also, England had the state church. That precedent was already there. Of course, any even mild student of history knows that we fought a war so that we so that we could get away from an established state church. But there's even more to the story than that. There were the anti-federalist letters. Many letters at the time that we have on record criticized the ratification for its general disregard of religion and indifference towards religion. They criticized it in a warning that since God was absent from the Constitution, America would suffer the curse pronounced by Samuel in 1 Samuel 15:23, because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee. Many asserted that it would be impossible to establish an enduring government without public protection for religious belief, not realizing that the separation of church and state was the exact protection that they were seeking, and remains so to this day, which Christians would realize the second they were in the minority. In 1789, a group of Presbyterian clergy wrote to George Washington complaining that the Constitution contained no reference at all to the one true God and Jesus Christ who he hath sent. The people who wrote the Constitution and who ratified it were aware of the absence of God. The citizens of the United States had made them so. And yet, there's no reference to God whatsoever. It can't be argued that they intended to put God into the Constitution, just forgot to do that. They knew, and they knew easily. At the state ratification conventions, even more objections were raised to the godlessness, in literally every word, to the Constitution. Luther Martin, one of the Maryland delegates in 1787, said there were some members so unfashionable as to think that a belief in the existence of a deity and of a state of future rewards and punishments would be some security for the good conduct of our rulers, and that in a Christian country it would be at least decent to hold out some distinction between the professors of Christianity and downright infidelity or paganism. That was not approved, it was rejected. From Connecticut, via William Williams, and I'd be a little cranky if my name were William Williams too. We, the people of the United States, in a firm belief of the being and perfection of the one living and true God, the Creator and Supreme Governor of the world, in his universal providence and the authority of his laws, do ordain, etc., etc., etc. These modifications were rejected by the drafters of the Constitution as well. A Virginia initiative wanted to replace the prohibition against religious tests for office with this statement: No other religious test shall ever be required than a belief in the one only true God, who is the rewarder of good and the punisher of evil. Now, these are what many Christians will use to try and convince us that we are founded as a Christian nation, one that intermingled government and religion. But if that were the case, why could there be all this pressure and all these suggestions that got rejected out of hand when the Constitution was finished? There is but one inescapable conclusion, and it's reflected in the Treaty of Tripoli, the final nail in the coffin we all know about, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Now, there are some objections to this, that in the Arabic version that got translated and handed to the Muslim, that the 11th article wasn't present. But it's irrelevant. This was read on the floor of Congress, and literally every single congressman at the time, the founders of our nation that were still there, voted in approval of it, and we do not have so much as a whisper of opposition on record. None. Nobody spoke in opposition to it. Nobody found it disagreeable in Congress at the time. The founders of this nation left God out of the Constitution intentionally. They had so many opportunities to put it in there, and they didn't. Separating the church from the state was precisely their intention. So the idea that the Supreme Court has got it wrong somehow, that we were founded on a nation where religion was supposed to be a part of the government, is simply absurd. And it's made by people with a very limited knowledge of history, a very limited knowledge of the law, and the only people who will ever buy that claim are people of equally limited knowledge. Sally Quinn also spoke about the Pledge of Allegiance. We all know the line, one nation, under God, indivisible, and we all know that it wasn't always that way. It used to be one nation, indivisible, before that divisive line was inserted. So let's talk about how it got in there. In 1954, President Eisenhower delivered a sermon based on the Gettysburg Address titled A New Birth of Freedom. He noted that the pledge's sentiments could be the sentiments of literally any nation. And rather than chalking that up to the fact that various nations have a lot of good ideas on how to treat one another, he said there was something missing from the pledge. He determined that what was missing, the definitive characteristic for the American way of life, as he put it, was the words, under God. And he used that to define what set the United States apart from other nations. Now, Eisenhower had been baptized Presbyterian just a year before, and immediately after signing the legislation to insert this into the Pledge of Allegiance, he said, I quote, "From this day forward, the millions of school children will daily proclaim in every city and town, every village and rural schoolhouse, the dedication of our nation and people to the Almighty. In this way, we are reaffirming the transcendence of religious faith in America's heritage and future. In this way, we shall constantly strengthen those spiritual weapons which forever will be our country's most powerful resource in peace or in war." And he was wrong. He could not have been more wrong. America does have powerful resources. Humanity has powerful resources, but humanity's most powerful resource is the human mind, and the way we have used it to transform the world. This planet was once a huge obstacle course with grave consequences. It was full of animals that were bigger and faster than us that thought we were tasty, full of hurricanes we couldn't detect. It was a world in which every single person had to work all day in the field just for the privilege of eating that night or on the hunt. It was a world where you couldn't drink water without worry of being sick. And prayer and faith has changed none of it. But we have, with only what we've got up here. There is no more powerful resource. And if we're going to pay homage to anything, it should be the real salvation of humankind. Our ability to think and our ability to reason. One nation under God, in comparison to the human mind, is little more than a taunt. It's little more than a way to say to other nations, such as the Russians at the time, the godless communists, which is why we put this in the Constitution, Daddy loves us more. and it really undersells what we've done to manage and direct our own fate. This is Marco Rubio. How many of you remember him from the RNC this year? Of course, Amanda Knief's hand goes up. He said, "We're special because we've been united not by a common race or ethnicity, but we're bound together by common values, that family is the most important institution in society," which is an ironic way to dig at other people who want to make families. "That Almighty God is the source of all we have." No, he's not. As the Romney campaign said, we built that. Special because we've never made the mistake of believing that we are so smart that we can rely solely on our leaders or our government. Our national motto is "In God We Trust," reminding us that faith in our Creator is the most important American value of all. Whoa. To which I can only say, bullshit. Yeah. There are lots of things to which we owe our allegiance, and it's not to soil, it's to ideas. We owe our allegiance to reason far more than we owe it to any god. We owe our allegiance to honesty more than we owe it to any god. Ditto to humility. Ditto to compassion. As America becomes less associated with these qualities, she becomes less deserving of our allegiance. These qualities are what make the ideal of America. Not our soil, not a flag pin. Reason. How does this look through the lens of religion? Nobody rose from the dead. Not ever. Not 2,000 years ago. And there is no way a reasonable person could ever come to that conclusion. That may seem offensive, but it's the way it is. Nobody walked on water. If you believe the physical constants of the universe were suspended just so your religion could be true, and you think that's far more important than any of the other values upon which the ideal of America is based, you've abandoned your patriotism. Consider even the premise of religion, that someone rose from the dead. This is in conflict with every way in which we know the universe to work. I mean, this is a question for biologists. Or you think physicists would have something to say about the idea of someone walking on water? Or that chemists would have something to say about the idea of someone being converted to a pillar of salt? Or geologists might have something to say about a global flood that left no evidence whatsoever. There is no reason in the spiritual and ludicrous claims of Christianity. And if we decide that reason is a quality to which we owe our allegiance, thanks, David. If we decide that reason is a quality to which we owe our allegiance, which is best for America, we owe it to ourselves to call people out on it. But I'll take it a step further and argue that reason is not just something that's best for the country. It's not just what has made mankind the kings and queens of this planet, but it's a moral obligation. It's a moral obligation that every single religious person fails. I haven't even made the argument yet. The 11-year-old girl in the teal t-shirt is a young lady named Madeline Newman. One day, Madeline became ill. And over the following weeks, she became more and more ill. Her breathing became shallow, her skin became pale, cold to the touch. And this went on over a period of weeks. And during that time, her parents never once summoned an ambulance. And you all know what the next step in the story is. Madeline died from type 1 diabetes, a completely treatable condition. And we all know the reason. Her parents never, ever picked up the phone to call a hospital because they believed that God would heal their daughter if their faith was strong enough and if they prayed enough. Now, if the word bad is to have any meaningful definition, people who watch while their child dies are bad. But there's something about them that should resonate with each and every one of us, and that's how similar we are. Because they loved their daughter as much as anyone in this room would love their child. They wanted their child to get better as much as anybody in here would want their child to get better. The difference between us wasn't that, as Christianity would have us believe, that there's something intrinsically malicious or morally repugnant about the human condition. Their intentions were pure. They just had a bad idea about how the universe worked that twisted their good intentions into madness. Which is why when anyone says to me of a Christian, their intentions are so good, isn't that enough? I can only say, no. Lots of people with good intentions do completely evil things. In fact, there are people all across this world who do transparently malicious things, all the while thinking they're doing good, because they failed to be reasonable. Now, if you have good intentions, you have a moral obligation, not only to yourself, but to every single person you share this planet with, to make every attempt to be reasonable, to map out reality to the best of your ability, to make sure that your good intentions are borne out in the actual results of your actions. And if you fail to do so, even if it's for the comfort of the religion you were born with, you are immoral. Period. And if you spread the idea that it's okay for other people to be unreasonable, even if it's under the banner of faith, you too are being immoral. And that is a position from which I will never back away. Honesty. We all saw Amanda Knief's talk the other day. When the religious groups argue for keeping "In God We Trust" on our currency as our national motto, do they say it has anything to do with religious privilege? Of course, we all know it does. They know it does. But what do they say? It's tradition, completely bereft of any religious overtones whatsoever. And it's a lie. And we all know it's a lie. But in order for that argument to stick, they can't tell the truth. And their religion is no help to them in getting them to tell the truth. The arguments for any piece of religion or legislation that's informed by their religion. Even a cursory look at the statistics on, say, gay marriage will show that people pretty much vote along religious lines. And yet we have all of these other arguments. It's not natural. It doesn't produce children. You'll never see them get up in front of Congress or in a court. And even though the fact they were raised in a religion that tells them that two people of the same gender getting married is an abomination, they'll never say it. I think that's dishonest. And I think America deserves better. And I think any patriot should do better. Humility. There's the obvious one of thinking the universe revolves around you, was made for you, and the creator of the universe has a specific interest in what goes on in your life. But to the atheist, this life is the most important. We can never write off suffering in this life because it will be better in another one. This is the only chance we get to create the most happiness that we can. And reason has always been our best tool for doing so, whether it's coming up with means to feed more people, or anesthesia when we're having surgery. This is our only chance, and it creates a sense of urgency that the belief that you're destined for heaven never could. We also believe that the United States is not special by default. God never said we were better than anybody else. We are a part of the global community. If we're going to be a leader, it's not by God deciding we're the best. It's by us earning it. We don't deserve prosperity more than any other citizen on this planet. And that's something you could never believe if God has set your religion apart from everyone else. We are all equal. We are one nation, indivisible. The worth of a person is decided by their compassion, by their humility, by their honesty, and by how much they care and how effective they are at working towards a better world for themselves and for everybody else we share the planet with. That's what equality means. No one is better because they believe in a particular God. And that is the vision that most atheists have for this country, and it's beautiful. Compassion. Remember Amanda's talk where she talked about religious groups turning away volunteers. And they're legally able to turn away volunteers, people who could be out feeding the poor or bringing aid to the sick, just because they don't believe in God. In this case, belief in a particular religion hamstrings our effort to be better, hamstrings our effort to care about others. Condoms in Africa, another easy one. Millions upon millions of people dying because the ideas of an ancient people are given more precedence than the agony of people or the lives of people hundreds and thousands of miles away. Lots of religious groups perform charitable acts. They deliver food to the starving, they deliver medicine. But the instant they deliver one Bible, they have become less effective than a charity that was never contaminated by that religious belief, as much as they'd like to say otherwise. The vision atheists have for America is where every single charitable dollar goes towards feeding someone or ending someone else's suffering. And it's something that doesn't happen right now because of religion. America can do better. Even the central tenets of faith are offensive to compassion in every single way. The idea that anybody in this room could spend their life, every waking moment, sleeping only when they had to, working towards making a better world and towards alleviating the suffering of others. But they could go to hell when someone like Osama bin Laden could accept Jesus 5 minutes before their death and think themselves truly deserving of paradise. That very idea makes a mockery of compassion. Sally Quinn also talked about "In God We Trust." It's our motto, it's on our money. Let's talk about that for a minute. This is John Hagee, everyone in this room's favorite human being. In response to Romney, shall we say, not doing so well in the polls, he said, "I am asking the Christians of America to join us in 40 days of prayer for this presidential election. These 40 days of prayer will begin on September 28th, 2012. You can do it individually or in groups, but prayer is the most powerful force God has given us to bring our nation back to righteousness." I wish they would really believe that and not take time away from praying to go vote, if prayer is so powerful. They say "In God we trust," but they don't. We trust our soldiers to fight our wars, and if we were to pray rather than to send soldiers, we would lose every single war we ever fought in. We trust doctors and medicine to cure the sick. When we pray rather than trusting our doctors, our children die. We trust ourselves to find our own fucking car keys. That is the trust we have in ourselves over the idea that we trust God. We trust humans. We do not trust God. We do it in prayer, we do it in war, we do it in legislation. Now, the argument will be that prayer augments human effort. You don't get to combine what works all by itself, like human reason, with what doesn't work all by itself, like prayer, and say that one helps the other. That's like saying whistling makes your grass get cut, or that singing in the shower makes you clean. It's a completely silly idea. The phrase "In God We Trust" is an empty bit of privileged praise for every Christian who believes in it. But they don't act it out. They don't live it. And the sooner they realize that, the sooner we can reach an America where patriotism means doing what is reasonable. To give you an example of what it looks like when we pray rather than act, I want to talk about a recent death in Orlando, Florida, when a 15-year-old girl was shot in a drive-by. Now, one would think that the immediate reaction would be to go look for clues, to start questioning people, to do everything in your power to track down who these people were. But the response of the Orlando Police Department was this: 40 days of prayer. It's neglect dressed up as effort. The chaplain of the police department, Willie James, said praying for safer streets is something that works. He was part of a similar project with the Orlando Police in 2008, and he said it worked. We did it all over the city of Orlando, and I'll tell you, the crime rate went down. Couldn't have been the fact that policemen were hired and paid and out trying to solve crimes. As Hem and Mehta would say, correlation is not equal causation. So what is the take-home message? The take-home message is simple. The religious right and the deeply conservative people in this country have hijacked patriotism for all of the wrong reasons. When an atheist says we are a patriot, we believe that loving America is more than a flag, or a pledge, or a pin. It's certain ideals that create the idea of America, and that as soon as America starts edging away from those ideals into things like intolerance, bigotry, irrationality, they've stopped being the America to which we've pledged our allegiance, and that is a very good thing. We realize that the solution to the world's problems will come from our own minds and from our hard work, not from prayer, not from well wishes or anything else, but by us actually getting up and doing things. We realize that political influence is more than voting. We need to go out and talk to people. Everything that Dr. Dave said in that last presentation, getting out, making ourselves visible, of changing minds. Nobody ever changes a mind in a single conversation. It's the product of months of planting the seed and creating cognitive dissonance. I'm willing to wager it's how everyone in this room who was once religious wound up coming to God. Whether it's because of Richard Dawkins' book, or hearing Greta Christina speak, or anything like that. It took us time thinking about it, because other activists were getting out and making us. A lot of us sit at home and do essentially the same thing as prayer and just hope things will get better. And the time for doing that has passed. We can't afford to do it. We have to get out and actually work. And that is the principle that atheism is built on, that all change comes from us. We are, in the eyes of the atheists, one nation, indivisible. As long as compassion is a central tenet to your personality and that you think is one of the founding principles of this country, that makes you a patriot. And that is what atheists strive for. The idea of love it or leave it never enters into our minds, though it certainly has entered our ears time and time again from people who are upset with us saying that there is no separation of church and state, or that praying doesn't do anything. We should strive for legislation that actually accomplishes what it's set out to do. We would say, love it, so fix it. Don't leave. Stay here. Change things. To us, if you want to know what the atheist agenda is, here it is. Going forward, as patriots, as atheists, we will be vocal. We will punish unreason at the polls to whatever extent we're able. We'll hold our fellow Americans accountable if they're being unreasonable by telling them that being rational is a moral obligation and that they are failing. We will act. We will stop sitting around and hoping and get out and actually do things. If you want to know what the atheist agenda is, this is it. This is it in a nutshell. This is everything that we are as political entities. It's not enough to keep pointing out to our leaders how many atheists there are. It's great, we should keep doing it, but it's not enough. We need to start engaging with religious people in our communities and start acquainting them with facts and arguments that they will never even get to glimpse from inside a church. We need to continue to change the electorate in our favor through our own actions. Now, it's true, everything you ever hear David Silverman say at a conference, we are winning right now. We are. But it's also true that we started so far behind that we're never going to be able to let up in our lifetimes. But if we keep at it, if we keep doing what we're already doing, then by the end of it, we will have achieved such change that the very idea that reason can be uncoupled from patriotism will be just as ludicrous as the idea of someone walking on water or rising from the dead. And that is the future we have ahead of us. Thank you. Dave Silverman. Got me? I'd ask your technique. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate that.
Wireless microphone. Record with? Oh.
GT, did you want to take a couple questions? Are there any questions? Yeah, Jesse, go ahead and just shout.
I just want to say, as soon as you need campaign staff, let me know.
What was it? Oh, God, who was the guy that led the union? And the union forces. Right, hit with him.
But yeah, one of my favorite quotes, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. Someone like me could never get elected to the office of president. I mean, you saw the first presidential debate. Telling the truth as a presidential candidate or candidate for any office is a death sentence, and I refuse to do otherwise. You know, there are people who are suited to be politicians. I'm not one of them. The first time a reporter asked me, what's your religious affiliation? Atheist. How do you feel towards Christians? I feel they're being more gullible than they should be. I'm done at that point.
JT for city council.
If nominated, I would not run. If elected, I would not serve. But thank you, I'm flattered.
Have you ever heard a good biblical justification for the right?
No. Well, these are the easiest questions ever.
Okay, well, it is all my fault we're running behind. So let's just give JT a huge round of applause. Thank you for talking.